Hello everybody, Thrash Til Death here. I'm going to be talking today about the new album by Deicide, To Hell With God. Deicide, obviously one of the progenitors of death metal, along with Morbid Angel and Death earlier on in the 90s and late 80s. And obviously one of the bands who codified the sort of tropes associated with the genre alongside those two bands and Cannibal Corpse. And this is their 10th studio album now, and it follows the same sort of formula that we've come to expect in Deicide over the years. And with that in mind, I just want to be clear about one thing before I start this review. I like death metal, I honestly do. But with each year that passes, I've become increasingly convinced that the genre is beginning to approach its expiry date. And I think the reason for that is that it's a genre that's very dogmatic about its classifications. There's only so far that a band can vary from the sort of template established by the sort of band's founding fathers in the late 80s and early 90s before it becomes not death metal anymore. Just look at bands like, for example, Opeth or At the Gates, who get accused for being not death metal. And as a result of that, I think that's leading to a lot of stagnation in the genre. There are some bands who still manage to sort of work within the genre's confines and still manage to do something new with it, but for every band like Nile or Behemoth or Augury or Septic Flesh or bands like those, there's dozens of others who just sort of rehash the same old riffs and don't contribute anything new. And if any one album sort of exemplifies my problems with death metal in the modern age, it's probably To Hell With God. Where do I start with this one? To Hell With God, an album like this is like a jackhammer. It's loud and abrasive for the first 5 minutes or so, but after that it just becomes monotonous and numbing. The riffs on this album basically are massive, fast flurries of notes, very muscular guitar sound, and very almost devastatingly fast solos, drumming, all the sort of regular things we've come to expect, and it goes nowhere. It's completely flat, it's completely one note for its entire 35-minute running time. The riffs, all the riffs are basically, they follow the death metal template, but they all follow the same template. They basically don't contribute anything to the songs they're in. They just feel so flat. One riff leads into another, and it's communicating the exact same tone, it's got exactly the same drive behind it, it's got exactly the same numbing rhythm to it. All the songs follow the same formula, all roughly 3.5 to 4 minutes long, beginning with a bunch of fast riffs, going into a sort of pounding chorus section, slowing down a bit while Glenn Benton chants out some blasphemous lyrics, and then into the massive solo section. And it's all been done before. There is nothing this album contributes that hasn't been done before. It's all redundant and it's all repetitive. God, this album annoys me simply because you know something? This album is not heavy. I know that sounds like an odd thing to say about a death metal album, but it's not. Extreme metal, death metal, black metal, grindcore should communicate this idea of something sinister, something dark, something violent just about to explode, something that's just about to erupt into violence. And Deicide don't communicate that. The sort of order and structure of the songs is so clear, so formulaic, just laid out in front of you without any sort of attempt to sort of embellish it or disguise it. All these riffs just sound monotonous. And I mean, everyone on this album can play. The drums are great, the guitars are great, production's fine. Glenn Benton's still a fantastic growler and bassist. Production's got everything in its rightful place, but in a way that's part of the problem. Everything on this album sounds so clean, so processed, so organised. There's none of that sense of orchestrated chaos that an album of this ilk should convey. And there's no layers to it, no new... this album frustrates me because it's difficult to identify exactly what's wrong with it, but it's just such a dull listening experience. It's boring. I mean, compare this album to something like Deathspell Omega's Paracletus last year. That album had a concept of tone and subtlety and different layers of composition, and it could play around with mood and ambience and nuance. This album, by comparison, is just such a repeated bludgeoning over the head, also monotonous and one note from beginning to end, that the sort of effectiveness of these fast, brutal riffs is lost. If there's one thing I could say for this album, is that the solos are probably the only really creative and innovative moments on it. But they sound like the reason they're good is that they sound like they're cribbed from another album altogether. They sound far too clean and harmonic to be on a Deicide album. These are not death metal solos. They sound far more in place on an All That Remains album as opposed to a Deicide album. Compare any one of these songs, compare To Hell With God, compare How Could You Call Yourself a God, Angels of Hell, Empowered by Blasphemy. Honestly, one of these songs are just interchangeable with another. Compare that to something like the new song by Obscura, Septuagint, which you'll probably be able to find on YouTube. Listen to sort of the conceptual complexity of that. Listen to the sort of progressive elements on it, the atmosphere, the use of melody. It's absolutely wonderful, that track, and it's heavier than this. Paradoxically, it manages to be more melodic and progressive and atmospheric and heavier at the same time. Everything on this album, it's not even offensive. There's nothing on here that even my grandmother would object to. Even the lyrics, they just sound like they've been done to death. Stuff that this would have been shocking maybe when Venom was doing it in 1982, but it's just so redundant. It's all been said before. And that's another thing I'd like to talk about, the lyrics. Glenn Benton, do you honestly think that there's anyone listening to the 10th Deicide studio album who isn't already intimately familiar with your views on Christianity and Jesus and God and all the sort of related concepts? Because nobody's reading these lyrics for your poetic ability, that's for sure. So I have to ask, why? What do you think the point of this is? It just sort of encapsulates the whole problem with this album. It just sounds redundant, and there's nothing on here that can shock, nothing on here that can surprise, nothing on here that warrants a second listen, nothing on here that inspires anything other than just boredom. So honestly, to hell with God, miss this album, basically avoid it at all costs, because really there is nothing on here that you haven't heard before and haven't heard done better dozens if not hundreds of times, by Deicide themselves no less. So yeah, probably the worst album I've heard so far this year. Anyway, I'm Thrash Til Death, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.